Conversations in Culture and Evolution is a product of a work group of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology that goes by the name of Culture and Evolution. Members of this work group are some anthropologists and archaeologists unhappy with the way in which our disciplines were treating Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection. And in order to compensate for this deficiency, we created this group. Now, today our guest is Professor Alex Mesoudi. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Carles. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks for coming. Now, Professor Alex Mesoudi is Professor of Cultural Evolution in the Human Behavior and Cultural Evolution Group at the University of Exeter, Cornwall's campus, UK. Professor Mesoudi is interested in how human culture evolved and how culture itself evolves over time. He uses experiments to simulate cultural evolution in the lab by getting people to make and copy technological artifacts like arrowheads or hand axes, or solve problems resembling real-world challenges. The aim is to understand how psychological and social processes have shaped cultural change, past and present. A very important part of his research consists in the construction of models of cultural evolution, models that explore how individual decisions, for example, when and from whom people learn, translate into population-level patterns of cultural change. He has modeled cumulative technological change, copycat suicides, and the effects of migration on cultural diversity. He also analyzes big data sets to explain real-world patterns of cultural evolution. Recent analyses have explored the cultural evolution of pop music and football tactics. Good. And here we have this excellent book that Alex published in 2011. This is the book, an absolutely must read for anyone interested, for all anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians, or for anyone interested in cultural evolution. The title is Cultural Evolution, How Darwinian Theory Can Explain Human Culture and Synthesize the Social Sciences. Good. Now, Alex, I'll ask you the question that we ask all our guests. In what way has Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection been relevant to your research? And in what way, well, I'm supposed to say that in what way is relevant for cultural evolution studies is obvious, because I don't know whether you can have a cultural evolution theory that is not Darwinian. So how do you see that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess as you just mentioned, describing my research, I'm interested in looking at cultural change as an evolutionary process itself, and also the evolutionary origins of culture. So evolutionary theory, Darwinian evolutionary theory, is pretty fundamental to my whole research program. I mean, I guess a good way of answering that might be why I got interested in it. So I guess I did an undergraduate in psychology, just standard psychology at University College London. And it was very proximate, I guess. So it was very all about how individuals perceive and attend to different stimuli and learn individually over time. I guess social psychology's got a bit of social stuff. But there, one of my lecturers was Henry Plotkin, who had written books on, I guess he called it evolutionary epistemology, but you can call it cultural evolution. But he was talking about cultural change and how evolution shaped our minds, and how, like I said, human cultural change can be seen as an evolutionary process. And it just seemed so much more interesting to me than straight psychology, which was just interested in individuals and how individuals think. It seemed much more interesting to me, even back then, to think about how our minds came into being from our hominin ancestors, what selection processes led to our cognition, to our psychology, that allows us to learn so many different things from other people, and also seeing cultural change itself as another evolutionary process that interested me a lot as well. So you don't just have genetic evolution, like other biologists usually think about, humans have this cultural evolutionary process. And so we are the joint products of our genetic evolutionary legacy, but also our cultural evolutionary legacy. That seemed just so much, it's really, really interesting to me. And I guess evolution is one of the best big ideas that kind of linked together all of these different things. And then that led me into anthropology and archaeology and biology more broadly, trying to go beyond just individual minds and trying to think about how ideas accumulate over time and how they select over time. So I guess that's how I got interested in it. I guess whether it's Darwinian or not is an interesting question. I guess it obviously depends on how you define Darwinian. So in my book that you kindly just showed on the screen, I made a distinction between Darwinian and neo-Darwinian. So I argued that Darwinian is the ideas that Charles Darwin, put forward in The Origin of Species in 1859. Because back then he knew nothing about genes or genetic inheritance or DNA or anything like that, mutation, anything like that. I think there's evidence that he had Mendel's book on his bookshelf, but he never read it because it was in pristine condition. So Darwin basically came up with a very abstract understanding of evolution, which is basically you have variation in a population, you have some kind of inheritance, so that variation is inherited to other individuals, and usually there's some kind of selection, so not all variants are equally likely to be passed on to the next generation. And so he applied that to organismal evolution. I guess basically I would see it fairly uncontroversial to apply the same ideas to cultural change. Ideas vary in a population of humans. They are inherited in the sense of being passed on socially, not genetically, but socially. We copy other people, we learn from them in classrooms. So there's a social inheritance, and there's usually some kind of selection. So not all ideas are equally likely to be passed on to different people. And so to me, that's the core of what cultural evolution is, applying those general Darwinian ideas, variation, inheritance, and selection, to cultural change, where it seems obvious to me that cultural systems, human cultural systems at least, show those three characteristics. I guess by neo-Darwinian, I said cultural evolution is not necessarily neo-Darwinian, by which I meant all of the details of genetic inheritance and the Mendelian rules and having discrete replicators like genes. So we don't necessarily have to be too strict in thinking about cultural change in those terms. We don't have to think of discrete ideas as discrete particles that transmit in an all or nothing fashion in a Mendelian way, with very high fidelity. So we don't have to be too strict to that gene-based account of evolution, but the broad general idea of evolution that Darwin put forward in The Origin of Species, yes, in my book I was arguing, and other people have argued, can be applied to understand cultural change in a useful way.
Good. And well, when we think about cultural evolution, I mean, there is basically two terms, the term culture and the term evolution. So let's start with the term culture. I mean, how would you define culture?
That's a very good question. There was a book written many years ago now that found, I think, 300 definitions of culture across the social sciences. So different disciplines define it in different ways, and members of the public have an understanding of culture. I guess in the field of cultural evolution, we take a very broad definition, inclusive definition. So it's anything that is socially learned from another individual, anything that's socially transmitted through imitation or spoken or written language or teaching. So things we might call attitudes or opinions or beliefs, or how to make a tool or a religious idea, an institution, institutional rules. So anything that is learnt from another member of the species, as opposed to genetically inherited. So that would not be culture, that would be genetic inheritance. And I guess things that we come up with on our own and don't tell anybody else, that don't spread, that wouldn't be culture because it doesn't have the social aspect. But anything that is socially transmitted from one individual to another, I would count as culture. And then I guess you have different maybe elaborations of that definition. So one elaboration might be that you have regional differences in cultural traits or cultural variants. So people in, I don't know, people in Spain use knife and fork, people in Japan use chopsticks. Might be a cultural tradition that arises from social learning. So you learn how to use knives and forks from your parents or from your peers. And same in Japan, they learn to use chopsticks from their parents and their peers, and that generates between group differences or regional differences. So you can say that's cultural traditions. And then people are also interested in the idea of cumulative culture. So that's maybe even more specific subcategory maybe of culture. So that's the idea that cultural traits accumulate in complexity or inefficiency over time in a way that maybe only humans we only see in humans. And so I guess, yeah, culture is very broadly anything that is learnt from other individuals. Cultural traditions is where culture generates differences between different groups, and cumulative culture would be where those cultural traits accumulate in efficiency or cultural fitness, if you like, over time.
So Taylor's definition is still valid, no, isn't it? I mean,
that complex whole, yeah,
that we get for as members of society. I mean,
yeah,
there will be knowledge that we get, socially produced knowledge, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
Yes, I mean, I guess some socio-cultural anthropologists would prefer maybe something more about symbolic communication, or something about representation, shared representations, which would certainly be included in my definition of culture, but I prefer to be more inclusive. So those things are worth definitely require some special explanation, but we should also think about the words that we learn and the tools that we use. And I think it's useful to be better to be too broad and try to explain everything within a single framework rather than focus specifically on something that might be linguistically maybe mediated. I guess another useful thing is because that opens us up to studying culture in other species, in non-human species. So if you define culture as something that humans have, then you've almost defined it. You've defined away the possibility of studying other species. Whereas if you define it broadly as anything that is learned socially from other individuals, then now many other species have culture. And we're quite happy in the field of cultural evolution to say that. So chimpanzees learn how to crack open nuts with hammers, with hammer stones by observing their mothers. Right through to, even bees learn how to find flowers by doing waggle dances and communicating where the location of the flower to each other in the hive. So I would be quite happy calling all of these cases of whenever one individual learns something from another individual, whether it's a bee or a chimpanzee or a bird song, whale song, and other examples. I'm quite happy calling all of these culture because it allows us to study culture in other species, and then allows us to think about how did this capacity for culture evolve. It didn't maybe just spring completely as if by magic in humans. It has these antecedents, if you like, or parallels in other species, and we can compare chimpanzees and humans and whales and humans and compare their cultural capacities and think about whether it's think about the evolutionary selection processes that gave rise to the ability to learn from other individuals.
That's right, because anthropologists traditionally they say, well, culture is what defines human beings and is characteristic of human beings. But then primatologists keep saying that no, primates also have culture, and other students of animal behavior say other species also have culture, which probably it's true. But then also raises the question, and what would be because there seems to be a clear difference between human culture and non-human culture. What would be that difference?
Well, yeah, so lots of research, including some of my own, has focused on this idea of cumulative culture. So
Cumulative
the
culture,
idea
right?
that we can, so chimpanzees, they learn how to crack open nuts from other individuals. So that's culture. We can even have cultural traditions in chimpanzees. So this group of chimpanzees in this part of Africa cracks open nuts in one way, and this other group cracks open nuts in a different way. So we can say maybe that's analogous to knives and forks and chopsticks, maybe that I just mentioned. So I'm quite happy. I guess the pioneering work of my PhD supervisor, Andy Whiten,
And the wise, and that's right.
determined all of these cultural traditions in chimpanzees. Bird song as well. You have different dialects of bird songs. I guess what is most controversial is whether other species can accumulate beneficial cultural traits over successive generations. So if you think about chimpanzee nut cracking, it's plausible that a single chimpanzee on their own could have come across some stones and some nuts and maybe accidentally or maybe intentionally just figured out that you can use this stone to hammer open the nut and get the nut out, and that's good. Whereas if you think about the technology that we take for granted, the computer that I'm talking to you now on, or the iPhone in my pocket, it's just not possible that a single human being could ever have invented on their own an iPhone, for example. You have to extract the minerals that it's made from, you have to code all the software, you have to make a GPS satellite to have the GPS. So it's the accumulated product of many, many generations and many, many different individuals' good ideas, basically. So we don't seem to see that in any other species. There's no sense in which chimpanzee nut cracking technology has gradually improved over time and got better and better to exceed what a single chimpanzee could invent on their own. They don't have, diggers and mechanical drills or anything like that we do. So I guess that's probably what most people have been interested in, trying to figure out why only humans have this cumulative culture that improves over the generations, going beyond what a single individual could achieve on their own. And I guess there's various ideas. That just begs the question, why do humans have cumulative culture and other species not have cumulative culture? So people have thought about maybe it's the fidelity with which we can transmit ideas. Maybe we can just transmit things better with more fidelity than other species, maybe because of our language, maybe writing had some role in it. So ideas are not lost over the generations, they can build up. Maybe it's something to do with our population structure. We have larger numbers of individuals, or societal structures where we have different groups all coming up with different ideas and then exchanging ideas with frequent migration that maybe other species don't have. There's lots of research, and it's kind of an open question why only humans have cumulative cultural evolution and other species just have cultural traditions and just have culture. So an interesting question that I don't think anyone has
Yeah,
fully addressed.
yeah. Well, some people say what I think is a rather controversial idea that say children tend to over imitate when they are taught something, unlike chimpanzees, for instance. That is to say, they copy useless aspects of a particular action, and that is precisely what enables the accumulation of culture, which is a bit paradoxical, isn't it?
That's an interesting topic. So that was Andy Whiten again did the original experiments there, I think, where he had puzzle boxes and there was a treat in the puzzle box, and some of the actions were relevant for opening the door, and some of the actions were irrelevant. So just tapping on the top, like 5 times, which had no function in opening the box and getting the treat out. And he did it with chimpanzees, and he did it with, I think, 5-year-old children, maybe young children, and the children copied everything. They copied the tapping 5 times, whereas the chimpanzees ignored the tapping once they could see that it was irrelevant and went straight for the food. So in that case, in theory, the chimpanzees had better imitation because they were ignoring the irrelevant stuff. But Andy and others have argued, well, maybe it's in that case, in that experiment, it was better to ignore the irrelevant stuff. But if you're making a hand axe or an iPhone or something like that, often it's not clear to us what is irrelevant and what's relevant. What do you need? How do you need to hit this bit of stone in order to make an Acheulean hand axe effectively, in order for the things to fall off? I've tried it. It's extremely difficult to know the angle and the force with which to hit the rock in order to get a perfect symmetrical hand axe that our ancestors were extremely good at doing. So for things where it's not obvious, it might be better to just copy what an adult is doing, or copy what everything that an expert is doing, and you should arrive at the adaptive trait, the hand axe or the iPhone or whatever, or programming, or the opaque things that we all are able to do. I guess there's a cost, because sometimes we will be copying actually irrelevant things. We can think of many examples of that. So irrelevant nonsense things that transmit in human cultures. Not everything is adaptive. But maybe that's the key, because other people argue maybe we're a bit more discerning, and we're not quite as mindless as just mindlessly copying everybody else. We have some kind of causal understanding, but certainly I think there's some truth to the idea that a lot of things are preserved just through over copying, over imitation, where we don't necessarily completely understand why we are copying, or why the thing that we are copying works effectively.
So in a way, it is like saying that there is cumulative culture because we are not because we are more rational, but because we are less rational in a way.
In a way, yeah. So I mean, people like Joe Henrich and Rob Boyd say that cumulative cultural evolution is smarter than us. It's smarter than the individual. So
right.
the wisdom of many generations, all doing trial and error and preserving the best ideas in each generation and combining them over time, that exceeds, that is smarter in many cases than what any single individual could come up with. Going back to this idea of cumulative culture, maybe things are changing in very recent times with companies, science and companies doing research and development, or maybe even artificial intelligence is changing it. Maybe artificial intelligence is coming up with the ideas. Maybe you can see that as a kind of cultural evolution. But yeah, possibly the idea that we that rather than seeing copying as a bad thing, and I'm a lecturer as you are, we penalize our students for copying and plagiarizing things. Maybe we should see copying as a kind of a smart thing to do in many cases. And as Joe Henrich said in his book, it's the secret of our success. The secret of human success is our ability to effectively copy things, because those things accumulate into things that exceed things like iPhones or space shuttles or quantum physics, things that exceed what any single individual could come up with on their own, with their own sort of rationality.
Yeah, that's right. Now, let us move now to the other concept in the cultural evolution phrase, the word evolution. I mean, when Darwin used the word evolution, he used it in a very different way from the way in which had been used before him in the 19th century. So what is Darwinian evolution?
Yes, I guess I go back to what I was saying a bit earlier about how he laid it out in The Origin of Species, where you have variation, you have inheritance, and you have some kind of selection or differential persistence of something. I guess for me, that's the core of Darwin's idea. I guess before Darwin, it was maybe more essentialist. People thought of species as having essences, and those essences sort of transform from one essence to another. I guess one of Darwin's major innovations in The Origin of Species was this population thinking in terms of finches are not just all the same. There's not some finch essence or giraffe essence or something like that transforms into some other species. You have to think in terms of a population of finches that vary in their beak size, for example, or population of giraffes that vary in their neck length. And then these characteristics are inherited we now know genetically, but Darwin didn't know didn't know much about genes, but offspring resemble their parents in these characteristics. And often there's some kind of selection going on. So finches with larger beaks tend to have more offspring than finches with smaller beaks, for example. And over time, that generates evolutionary change. So it's about the change within the population over time. And I guess that's what in cultural evolution we try to how we try to think about cultural change. So you've got a population of ideas, if you like, political beliefs maybe. They're transmitted socially from one individual to another, from a parent to a child, but also from a teacher to a pupil, or from one peer to another. And then often there's some kind of selection or sorting, so not all ideas are equally likely to persist. Sometimes these ideas do better than other ideas, or one tool is transmitted better than another tool for various reasons. So to me, that's the core of evolution, the idea of Darwinian evolution. Just very simply, there's variation in something that is culturally transmitted, which is the inheritance process, and usually there's some kind of selection so that not all ideas are equally likely to be passed on.
Good. So it's variability, inheritance, selection, the three ingredients. Now, if evolution originally was applied to biology by Darwin, but now we think that we can also apply this very same process to culture. You have identified the way in which we can do that with culture, because in culture we also have variability, we have inheritance, and we have process of selection. But what could be the main difference between biological evolution and cultural evolution then?
Yeah, that's a very good question that lots of cultural evolution researchers have looked at. So beyond that, there are many differences, I guess, and we shouldn't try and slavishly force culture into a genetic evolutionary framework where it doesn't necessarily fit. So I guess one obvious example is in humans, at least, we get our genes from our parents exclusively, from our mother and our father. Whereas in cultural evolution, we can get ideas and beliefs from our parents, sure, but also from our friends and from our teachers and from the internet and from books. So there are many more pathways, I guess, of cultural inheritance than there are genetic inheritance. Not quite as clear-cut as that, maybe, because you have horizontal gene transfer in bacteria and plants, say. So you also have sort of genes moving from one individual to another that are not necessarily vertical from parents to offspring in biological systems, but certainly there's more pathways in cultural evolution, which may make it faster potentially. I guess one other difference that people talk about is that in genetic evolution, mutations are usually considered to be random or blind with respect to their function. So it's a mutation that is useful for a species or an individual is no more likely to arise, a genetic mutation that is, than a detrimental mutation or a mutation that has no effect whatsoever. Whereas in cultural evolution, possibly because people maybe have intelligence, some, as we were talking about, limited rationality maybe, but some kind of rationality. Often people are trying to come up with solutions to problems. People come up with tools that they think might work, so it's not quite as random as in the genetic evolutionary case. So maybe more directed in cultural evolution. Cultural mutations are more directed, which again may make it faster. But then on the other hand, if our intelligence is not good enough to come up with a problem, then maybe that might push us down blind alleys, and maybe randomness sometimes is a good thing. And I guess another idea, another difference that people have talked about is the fidelity of transmission. So even though, as we were saying, things like over imitation allows quite high fidelity transmission, a cultural transmission, it's still not as high fidelity as genetic inheritance. So genes are transmitted with very high fidelity through DNA replication, whereas ideas, we copy them, but often we transform ideas, or we make mistakes in copying them, or we interpret them in different ways. So there's probably more error, more transformation of ideas as we are copying them in cultural evolution. So these, I guess, three interesting differences. And I guess the interesting thing is you can build models of cultural evolution incorporating these differences. So just like biologists build models of genetic evolution and they assume that genes go from parents to offspring exclusively, we can also build theoretical mathematical models of cultural evolution where we can change those assumptions. We can assume that people get their ideas from their peers or from their teachers and see what effect does that have on the rate of cultural change compared to the rate of genetic change. So I see these differences not as a problem for cultural evolution, but as an interesting challenge to try and understand how does cultural evolution differ from genetic evolution, and what consequences do these differences have for, say, the speed of cultural evolution, or for the extent to which ideas accumulate over time?
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things you mentioned, I think, is particularly interesting because, well, I was reading an article now published, written by David Sloan Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, and it was recently published, and it was about the work of French theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, that he tried to integrate science and religion, and using the word evolution and the concept of evolution very often. And one of the things that Teilhard de Chardin said was that in humans, evolution has become conscious of itself. And whatever we make of that statement, I mean, the idea that in human evolution and in human cultural evolution, there is a kind of consciousness. I mean, that whereas in biological evolution is clearly blind, is a random process. Mutations are random. Nobody decides the mutations. Selection is decided somehow because only adaptive mutations are reproduced but the mutation itself, I mean, is random. Whereas in the case of humans, well, sometimes we accept cultural institutions unconsciously, but sometimes consciousness has a role. I mean, I mean, it's very hard to understand human behavior without taking consciousness into account somehow. I don't know. I mean, that makes it difficult, isn't it? Or I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it makes it difficult and challenging. Yeah, I guess
yeah,
we have to think about where I mean, you can say consciousness. I guess, like I said, my first degree was in psychology, so I guess I would think of this as, these are the psychological processes that cause people to make one decision over another, or transform an idea in a certain way. So I would say, these are all amenable to study, say, in the laboratory, or study by psychological methods. You can study how people transform ideas over time. You can study people's decision making. Behavioral economists also do this in experiments and look to see when people follow institutional rules, or when do they cooperate, or when do they free ride. So I don't think it's quite as mysterious, maybe, as some people in the social sciences or humanities sometimes make out. I think these psychological processes are perfectly amenable to scientific study, and they would be at the center of a field of cultural evolution, because we want to know, how do people transform ideas over time? Why do they choose one thing over another? It's not as random as it is in genetic evolution, but it still is amenable to study. I guess I would say also it's not quite the case that, I mean, people sometimes say, well, all you need to understand about cultural change is how individuals think. I think Steven Pinker's made this argument. So if you understand one individual's psychological processes, then you can just predict how cultural change works. I don't think that's the case, though, because often different people have different ideas. Not everybody is the same. Different people are coming up with different political ideologies, different tools. How do we know which one is going to be preserved and transmitted to subsequent generations? So there's some kind of cultural selection process there of the different variations. So back to Darwin's idea of variation. Not everyone is coming up with the same ideas. Often, as we said before, it's not obvious to people how to solve a problem. And often many advances in the history of science and technology have been serendipitous or accidental, things like X-rays or penicillin or Velcro. There's a long list of inventions that just came about by accident. I guess Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin when he went on holiday and left the window open, and some bacteria and the penicillin infected his Petri dishes by accident, and then he discovered this penicillin that was changed the world of medicine and saved millions, if not tens of millions of lives in the 20th century. So not everything is the product of clever, intentional decision making. I think we still need this Darwinian population thinking to understand the totality of cultural change. I don't think we can't understand cultural change just by understanding a single individual. We need to know the population of ideas, the population of individuals, and how these things play out over time, which is the fundamental basis of any evolutionary process.
That's right. That's right. Well, Daniel Dennett coined this expression, competence without comprehension. I mean, to talk about this blind process. I mean, and it's true. I mean, in culture, we have competence without comprehension. We all use these machines. I mean, we are competent, but we don't understand, most of us, how they work. So in a way, I mean, it applies equally to culture. But obviously, as you said, I mean, you cannot get rid of the idea of consciousness in a way. I mean, somehow consciousness must play a role. And this brings me to another question that is also sometimes bring forward when you talk about evolution. I mean, it's the idea. I mean, Darwin's evolution was basically without a purpose. I mean, teleology for biologists is a kind of taboo word. I mean, there is no teleology there. I mean, evolution is blind. But then when we move to cultural evolution, one wonder, is there a purpose, or is there an end of cultural evolution, or is not? I mean, how do you see that?
I guess I would say no.
No.
And I guess I think so. I guess the history of cultural evolution is interesting as well. So in the late 1800s, Tyler was one of them that you mentioned, I think. They came up with theories of cultural evolution inspired by Darwin, but they kind of didn't really adopt Darwin's ideas in the way that I was mentioning earlier. So I guess early anthropologists in the late 1800s saw evolution as progress along a ladder of increasing complexity or increasing sophistication, something like that. And they tried to fit entire societies on this ladder. So you start with savages, and then barbarians, and lower barbarians, and upper barbarians, and then civilization, and then obviously the white European Victorian society was at the top of the ladder of complexity, because these theories were being written by white Victorian scientists. I guess we would see that as an incorrect idea of evolution. That's not what Darwin was talking about at all. So Darwin was kind of rejecting that stage-like idea of progress along a fixed ladder. So he's saying humans are not at the top of any evolutionary ladder. We're one branch of a big evolutionary tree, and there are lots of dead ends, and there's no general evolution, whether it's genetic or cultural. There's no general progress towards complexity, because there's no along a ladder, because there's no ladder. It's a tree. It's a haphazard tree that adaptation, that evolution is pushing different species along. So I guess we would kind of reject that idea of progress in the modern field of cultural evolution. So there's no real sense in which, and people like Kroeber came along and convincingly showed that those early schemes didn't really make empirical or logical sense anyway. So you can't really put societies along a ladder of increasing complexity. There's no sense in which one society is more evolved than another. Just like there's no sense in which one species is more evolved than another. It's just gradual change. Usually the rule is diversification rather than moving along a fixed ladder. So different societies evolve along different routes and different pathways, and trying to fit them along trying to think in terms of progress along fixed stages of increased complexity is really the wrong way of thinking about both genetic evolution and cultural evolution. So in that sense, no, I don't think there's no intrinsic progress to or no end point to cultural evolution in the same way that there's no end point to genetic evolution. There's no, I guess, Darwin was famous for saying there's no single creator pushing species, guiding species. There's also no single creator, I guess, guiding cultural evolution. There's lots of individuals with their own individual interests and consciousness and rationality, but that's very different to a single overarching direction of progress. Some people have argued that might be intrinsic increases in complexity. So you might see, say hunter-gatherers, like egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, as relatively, I guess, simple in inverted commas, or and then I guess large-scale societies with division of labor and specialization and in industry and things like that, maybe more complex, if you want to use that word. And people have shown that through history, societies tend to become more socially complex. I mean, obviously, because if we go back, say, 100,000 years, everyone was a hunter-gatherer, and now we're living in industrialized societies. But I guess there's no sense in which that process is inevitable or fixed, and it's perfectly possible that societies could decrease in social complexity, if you like. So there's no, and there's obviously different ways of having an industrialized society, a Western way, a Japanese way. So there's no fixed progress. There's no fixed ladder in which over which whole societies change. Rather, we're thinking about how different ideas or different beliefs within a society change over time, and that generates diversity of societies.
Yeah. But sometimes you can't help thinking of that there is a kind of improvement, isn't there? I mean, in the way things are. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you compare, for instance, the software now that we use with in our computers with what we use, I don't know, 20 years ago, I mean, there seems to be a clear improvement.
Yeah, so I guess that's this idea of cumulative culture. So it's interesting thinking about the links between those. So we have this cumulative culture, but I guess I guess two things. One, it's never inevitable, so it's not
right.
inevitable that our software would get better, and under some circumstances the software might get worse. And people have said that software is becoming so complicated that nobody understands how lots of big software systems work, and so then they kind of got all this weird legacy code that's messing it all up, and it would be much better if we just started again. So there's I guess organizations, you work in a university, so do I. I'm sure you'll be familiar with administration sort of getting more and more elaborate over time. That doesn't necessarily help us do our jobs. So you have this sort of, it's not necessarily improving over time, it's just getting more and more elaborate. So it's not necessarily the case that the improvement is inevitable or fixed. And also there's often many different ways of improving. So if we had a time machine and went back and replayed history, we might be in have a completely different improved software system compared to the one we do today. So I guess it's yes, there's cumulative culture in the sense that things are improving. I guess that's what selection does. It selects the things that are more effective than other things. But there's no sense in which that's inevitable or that there's only one way of improving everything, that we're all following along. Also, I guess we're thinking again in terms of specific traits like programs, like software programs, rather than whole societies like the early anthropologists did. So there's no sense in which whole society gets more complex, or the whole society goes along the sort of a ladder of complexity towards some end point. It's thinking about the different components of society, the traits within society that gradually change over time to gradually become more beneficial. Just like Darwin thought about different traits within society, like finch beaks gradually increase in size because finches with bigger beaks could open more diverse seeds and so survive the drought better. That's kind of improvement in a sense, because the finches were getting better at opening seeds on the particular Galapagos island that not him but later biologists were studying. So we would say that's improvement, but there's no sense in which finches inevitably evolve bigger beaks everywhere. It's always dependent on the particular environment that they're living in. The same is true of cultural evolution, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember now so-called neo-evolutionist anthropologists in the mid-20th century, like Leslie White, that he was trying to find a way of objectively define improvement, really. I mean, in the way he understood. I mean, and he was thinking of terms of the harnessing of energy and things like that. But I don't think that was successful, because in a way, eventually the conclusion was always the same, that our society was the most evolved, and then other societies were the less evolved. So in a way, it was introducing value judgments there all the
Yeah.
time.
I think it was still that legacy of that societal progress along
Yeah,
stages. He
that's
was still thinking
pre-Darwinian.
in
Yeah,
those terms. I think Julian Stewart maybe was
Julian
kind of made
Stewart,
this
that's right.
distinction between multilinear evolution and unilinear.
That's
So
right. That's
multilinear
right.
is a lot closer to modern cultural evolution. But yeah, Leslie White was still a bit early. Still had that legacy of thinking in terms of stages and
Yeah,
progress along a
that's right.
ladder, which is very actually un-Darwinian if you talk
Darwinian,
to
that's right.
biologists. It's non-Darwinian. But energy is so I guess the interesting thing is I guess biologists talk about fitness as their currency, if you like, of genetic evolution. Number of offspring is kind of what they measure in terms of fitness, because it's an interesting and not so straightforward thing to think about. What is cultural fitness? And you talked about energy there. I guess White was trying to think about how traits use energy and energy efficiently, and that might allow us to predict, say, technological evolution. I guess that's one way of thinking about it. But then, if you think about other domains like music, I mean, it's not quite clear how that framework of energy efficiency could explain why one song is transmitted better than another song. I think in that case, we might be better off thinking about the psychological, perceptual processes of how we hear music and how aesthetically how we like different melodies. That seems to be more relevant than something like energy. Or if you're thinking about, say, political ideas, how effectively does it organize a society? How does it benefit this section of society rather than another? So it's often quite interesting and not so straightforward to think about what is the measure of cultural fitness that cultural evolution is operating on, and there may be very different currencies, if you like, of cultural fitness that makes it again maybe more complicated than maybe the genetic evolutionary case.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. Let's talk about the so-called schools of cultural evolution. Some people say that there are two schools. I mean, the so-called or the Paris school and the Californian school. And the Paris school is based upon the theories of Dan Sperber, the anthropologist and cognitive scientist. And the California school would be based upon the writings of Pete Richardson and Robert Boyd. And I don't know whether I see very well the difference between these two. It seems to me that the Paris school seems to emphasize the idea of evoked culture, whereas the California school would put the emphasis on transmitted culture. But I think culture must be both necessarily evoked and transmitted. No? How do you see this distinction?
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. That's what I've tried to argue, trying to link them together. Yeah, so I guess I'm not sure it's helpful really to label schools, because then suddenly you're competing and become like little tribes competing against each other, rather than as you just tried to do, Carlos, trying to fit the ideas together. I think that's much more useful in science. But yeah, I guess broadly the Paris school associated with Dan Sperber argues more for this transformation over time. So they argue that rarely do we faithfully exactly copy ideas. Almost always we transform them, and we transform them in predictable ways, reflecting our cognition usually. So if you have a story, then you might transform it into a story that's more intuitive, more easy to understand. If you have a song, you might or a joke, you might retell it in a way that's funnier, that you think is funnier for a particular audience. So you transform things over time, and they argue that that's possibly the most important process in cultural evolution. Whereas I guess the California school with Boyd and Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, Joe Henrich, also Mark Feldman and Cavalli Sforza. So they maybe emphasize cultural selection a bit more. So this idea of blind copying and not necessarily understanding what you're doing, or not necessarily transforming things. You're just maybe the variation is coming up semi-randomly, as we've already discussed, and then people copy good things, and so it's a lot more like the over-imitation case that we were talking about earlier, and less intentional transformation. So it kind of links to the ideas we've already discussed. But like you, I guess, Carlos, I always see these as both of these processes are operating in cultural evolution. Sometimes we transform things, sometimes we copy things exactly because we don't understand how they work. It probably depends on the domain as well. So there's a nice study by Olivier Moran, who was a student of Dan Sperber. I guess he's in the Paris school. He did a nice study of portraits and looked at historically famous portraits, pictures of people, and showed that over time they went from averted gaze, so the person in the portrait is looking away from you as the viewer, and gradually became direct eye contact. So the subject of the portrait was looking directly out of the painting, and he argued this is a kind of transformation, that we find it more salient. Eye contact is more salient, and so painters were gradually transforming their paintings to be direct eye contact, because we find that more attractive, aesthetically, cognitively more attractive. So that seems quite plausible to me. There's other arguments about things like bloodletting. So you cut the traditional practice, so you cut near to where an ailment is, and you get rid of the bad blood. We know it doesn't really work, but it's kind of intuitive. You kind of get rid of the bad blood, and seems like lots of societies. So this is Helena Mitton's work, another great researcher from the Paris school. So she showed that different societies have all independently come up with bloodletting. So you get rid of the bad blood out of the place where you're injured, and actually it doesn't work, and you're more likely to get blood infections, and so it's actually a bad thing. But it's kind of intuitively appealing to get rid of bad blood out of your body, and so it's spread in that respect. So these examples seem perfectly reasonable to explain these in terms of this Dan Sperber-like transformation over time, whereas the iPhone that you just showed us, or the space stations, or quantum physics, these things, there's no sense in which we can they're intuitive in any way. Often they're non-intuitive. Like quantum physics is completely unintuitive. String theory, there's like 13 different dimensions, and everything's made of vibrating strings. It's completely unintuitive, and you can only arrive at it, I think, through building unintuitive mathematical models and empirically testing them. And that's a kind of blind cultural selection process that probably the Californian school can explain much better because it's so unintuitive. So I guess I would see different aspects of cultural evolution can be best explained by different by the Paris idea of transformation towards intuitive things, whereas other aspects of culture are much more easily explained, I think, in terms of maybe more blind, random coming up with ideas and then testing them and over imitating maybe the best idea along the lines of the California school. So I think it has to be some integration of both of those approaches personally.
Yes, yes, I agree with that. I mean, the author that you have mentioned, Olivier Morin, I mean, he actually in his book, I think it was How Traditions Live and Die.
Mm.
He was so radical. I mean, he said almost that traditions uh, uh, could exist without actually being transmitted. I mean, as if they had to be reproduced or reformulated each time, which I thought was an attractive idea because you think of tradition as something that comes from your ancestors or it comes from somewhere else.
Mm.
But he was arguing, I think, quite reasonably that that's just part of the picture. I mean,
Yeah.
that for a tradition to be reproduced, it has to have some conditions, okay, cognitive conditions or whatever. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
was interesting anyhow.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
as you say, I mean, we have to make these two things compatible.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I think it depends on what we're talking about. So something like a folk tale, yeah, absolutely. Folk tales, especially when they were transmitted orally before writing, they have to be, we have to be able to remember them, or a joke maybe that we tell in the bar. You have to be able to remember them, and they have to be they fit together so that we can reconstruct them every time. So we're not necessarily exactly copying a folk tale, Red Riding Hood or whatever, whenever we tell it to another person. We're not like tape recorders or anything like that. So for things like folk tales, I think Olivier is absolutely right. We're reconstructing it, and they have to be intuitively understandable and memorable to individual minds. But then, like I said, something like quantum physics, it's not quantum physicists don't they write everything down in mathematical equations because it's not intuitive, and it's not you can't just tell it in a bar to somebody else. You have to write it down and do a mathematical model and everything. So it's completely so that seems to me a case where it is direct transmission, very
Right.
faithful transmission with writing or with mathematical models. So it really depends on what
Mhm.
aspect of cultural evolution I think we are thinking about, which of these approaches works best.
Mhm. Now, let's talk a little bit about the theories of cultural evolution. I mean, one very popular theory to some extent was the so-called mimetic theory. I mean, the idea that, well, in biology we have genes, and in culture we have something that works a little bit like genes, which is this idea of memes that was coined by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. Not many authors in the social sciences have taken up this mimetic theory. Some have. I mean, Daniel Dennett, for instance. What do you think of this mimetic theory of culture?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting idea. I guess I would see it as probably two. So going back to the difference between Darwinian and neo-Darwinian, so I would see culture as Darwinian. I wouldn't necessarily see cultural change as neo-Darwinian. I think maybe that's the mistake that the mimeticists made. They tried to take too much of a genetic model and tried to fit it to culture where it doesn't necessarily work. So, for example, I guess the idea of a gene is a discrete unit that is transmitted or inherited in an all or nothing fashion. Either you get a gene from your parents or you don't get a gene. Whereas a cultural trait, an idea, you might, going back to what Dan Sperber has talked about, the transformation, it's not like you either get an idea or you don't. You might transform it in some way as you're getting it, or you might merge it with another idea. You might misunderstand it and it transforms into something else. So I guess you can call that a meme, but it certainly memes are not inherited with anything like the high fidelity of genes. And so maybe it's a bit misleading to call them memes if cultural traits they don't have fixed boundaries, they're not discrete. And, political ideology might go from extreme left to extreme right. It's not like they only have people on the left or people on the right, like you have people with one gene or a different allele. It's a continuum, so you have cultural traits that are on a continuum. So these cases don't really fit into a discrete meme like model. I guess the other problem, I think, with memetics is that often it tries to explain all cultural evolution in terms of the good of the benefit of the meme itself. So Richard Dawkins, I guess, has talked a lot about religion since the selfish gene. So he argues that religion is like a selfish meme. It parasitizes our brains and spreads because it benefits itself, and it's harmful for individuals and it's harmful for societies, according to Richard. And so cultural evolution you can see as selfish memes all spreading themselves. I think, again, that's a bit too extreme for me. I think maybe there are some cases where you have ideas that spread just because they're selfishly good at replicating. Maybe a irritating pop song that you can't get out of your head. You can see maybe it's not benefiting you to have this song that you heard on the radio stuck in your head all day. It's just replicating because it's catchy, it's irritatingly catchy. But things like our technologies, even our religions, I think there are benefits to individuals as well, benefits maybe to societies. Let's say David Sloan Wilson has argued. And so I think seeing everything in terms of the benefit to selfish memes is a bit of the wrong way to go. Sometimes some traits might be selfishly replicating themselves, but usually culture is adaptive and benefits individuals that use it, and possibly even whole societies as well. So I think memetics kind of went down had those couple of problems that means that it never really took off as an empirical science in a way that the broader idea of cultural evolution did, which doesn't really require discrete replicators and doesn't require us to think about how ideas selfishly replicate at the expense of ourselves necessarily.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, the idea that there is the very concept of meme, I mean, is a complex concept really, because how do you define a meme? What is a meme and what is not? I mean, whereas if you compare that with a gene, I mean, even though it can be sometimes controversial, what is a gene and what is not? I mean, it's much more precise than
Yeah.
more easily empirically identifiable than the meme.
Yeah, in a sense, I guess memetics could be neuroscience. I mean, really, what we're talking about, what is, an idea? We're talking about ideas or beliefs, but ultimately they're stored in people's heads, and so maybe memetics should be the study of how ideas are represented
Right.
in our neurons in brains, just like genetics is the study of how genes are represented on chromosomes in the form of DNA and so on. So I guess you could see memetics, maybe it should be analogous to neuroscience. It's just the problem is neuroscience doesn't have good enough methods, I guess, to understand completely how ideas, I don't think we can really point at a particular set of neural networks and say, oh, that's the idea of democracy, or that's the idea of how to make a basket or something. Our understanding of neuroscience is maybe lagging behind the analogous genetic knowledge, understanding of genetics in genetic evolution. So maybe memetics will be important, but only when neuroscience gets a bit better at understanding how information is represented in brains.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. On the other hand, I mean, one thing that I think memetics maybe was saying something interesting is when we compare, say, culture or cultural traits with biological traits, you always see this difference. I mean, non-adaptive biological traits, they disappear because they are selected out by the process of evolution, whereas in culture you have a lot of non-adaptive cultural traits that persist. And then how do you explain that? Well, they say, well, it is because they are not adaptive for us, but they are adaptive for themselves, as it were, like a virus. I mean, the viruses are not adaptive for us, and yet they exist because they manage to make copies of themselves at our expense.
Yeah, certainly some aspects of culture certainly fit that criteria. There's a good work on, say, witchcraft. So the idea of witchcraft and women in medieval times accusing each other of being witches. And there's good work by Steyer Hofhaus, who's analyzed historical records of witchcraft, and he showed it doesn't seem to benefit the individuals. It's not like women were benefiting from accusing other women of being witches, because often they would get accused in turn of being witches, and so then they would get persecuted. It doesn't seem to benefit the whole society, because everyone's just accusing each other of witchcraft and persecuting each other, and it's very detrimental. So it seems to be a selfish idea, just the idea that there are witches and you can accuse people of being a witch, and then they get burnt at the stake or whatever. It's just the idea itself spreads, but it's very bad for individuals and it's very bad for society. So those cases, I'd be quite happy to say is a case of a selfish meme spreading at the expense of individuals and societies, just because it's good at spreading, like I said, irritating, catchy pop music, but not everything, I guess. So technologies and tools and institutions, they're broadly beneficial to individuals and societies. So other cases, it's not so obvious. You can't really say that democracy is a selfish idea benefiting itself. I think there's benefits to benefits to individuals and benefits to societies as well.
Right. Then another way of understanding these apparently non-adaptive cultural traits is by means of the theory of cultural group selection, that things might not be adaptive for the individual, but they are adaptive for the group. I mean, group selection was or still is to some extent a taboo word for biologists, because biologists think that there is no such a thing as group selection in biology, but it seems that in cultural evolution that can be useful. I mean, what do you think? This is theory of cultural group selection.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, I mean, again, there's disagreement within the field of cultural evolution. Some people think it's a good explanation for human cooperation. Other people disagree and say it's not important. So it's not it's not the same as cultural evolution. It's a specific idea. So basically, the idea, well, so biologists say that group selection is not important in genetic evolution because the idea of group selection is that groups of cooperators all cooperate with one another, and they outcompete groups of selfish free riders, which intuitively sounds right, but in biology, people like Hamilton and Williams pointed out, well, that's a problem, because if you have migration, then one of the free riders can move to the group of cooperators, and one free rider in a group of cooperators does very well because they're benefiting from all of the cooperation from everybody else, but they're not paying the cost of cooperation. They're not paying the taxes or helping to build the well or fighting in the war or whatever. And so then free riders actually spread, and within groups, free riders do better than cooperators, even if between groups of cooperators do better than groups of free riders. So in biology, people kind of said, well, actually, it doesn't really work because of that fact, because free riders can move to groups of cooperators. People like Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson and others have argued, well, maybe cultural evolution is different. So we're thinking now about cultural idea. So the previous case, it was genes for cooperation and genes for free riding. If we change to think about maybe cultural traits, norms for cooperating and norms for free riding, they argued maybe cultural group selection is more viable. So you have groups of cooperators who all learn to be cooperative from other members of their society. You might have groups of free riders, but when those free riders move into the groups of cooperators, maybe there's punishment, we punish them, the free riders, or maybe there's conformity, so the free riders conform to the group majority, which happens to be cooperation. And so these cultural processes like punishment or conformity make it more likely that cultural group selection could work, because you don't have this problem of free riders moving from group to group. So it's an interesting hypothesis, and it explains, for example, why humans are so cooperative, I guess. We cooperate with strangers who we've never met before. We give to charity, donate to anonymous people. We pay taxes, even though we might not necessarily benefit personally from the things that our taxes pay for. So potentially, it's an explanation for these things which can't be explained in terms of obvious selfish benefit in a way that things in other species can, because throughout human history, groups of cooperators have culturally outcompeted groups of free riders. I guess it's a nice idea. I guess the empirical evidence isn't quite as solid maybe as proponents of cultural group selection make out, I guess would be my opinion. Because I guess there are alternatives. It could be that we have language and we have more sophisticated reciprocity, and so we're better at negotiating contracts and things. And I guess there's various other explanations. So it seems like cultural group selection is certainly more plausible than genetic group selection, but whether cultural group selection is the key explanation for why humans are so cooperative and live in such large societies, large cooperative societies, whereas chimpanzees and other non-human primates live in very small societies that tend to be bound by kin relations a lot more. Whether cultural group selection is the key explanation, I'm not 100% convinced, but I do like the idea.
Good. Well, Alex, we have to leave it here. That's all we had time for. Thank you very much for this conversation. It has been a pleasure and a honor to talk with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your time and inviting me, and thank you for the interesting questions. I hope you found it